Hello there, welcome to Talk is Cheap. Precious Eda is my name. It's been a while. Well, thank God I'm back. How have you been doing? This is my channel. Thank you for watching. I talk about leadership, relationships, personal development, and very interesting social issues. I comment on them and I draw leadership perspectives from them. Now today I'm talking about something that is very interesting, very interesting, considering or in the light of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Should nations be neutral in international politics? Should nations be neutral? I'm going to look at some leadership lessons I've been able to draw from the Russia and Ukraine crisis. Should nations be neutral? First of all, my thoughts, my heart goes out to every Ukrainian and every person in the world going through hardship, suffering from this mindless and meaningless, needless war that has been tagged as a special military operation by the Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's worrying, it's disheartening when you see children suffer, when you see people suffer. It's disheartening. Nobody thought that we would see such huge refugee crisis of over 4 million people displaced in this 21st century. This is 2022, and we're seeing this kind of things. My heart goes out to the Ukrainian people. I'm in support of them, and I pray that this crisis comes to an end as quickly as possible. Well, that being said, let's delve into the issue for discussion today. Now, the question is, should nations be neutral in the light of the Ukraine-Russia crisis? My thoughts on this crisis, and the question is, should nations be neutral? Now, first of all, let's look at the basis for this conflict in a nutshell. The basis for this conflict in a nutshell. Now, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, says that one of the reasons why he's invaded Ukraine is that Ukraine has decided not to be neutral. Ukraine has decided to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military defensive alliance. Ukraine has decided to join NATO. And Ukraine joining NATO and Ukraine being a very close neighbor to Russia, a border nation to Russia, it amounts to a threat to Russia's security. It amounts to a threat to Russia's security. Now, well, many people have come out and then justified Russia because they're world power, and they're saying that, well, yeah, when something is a threat to your security, you should respond appropriately. And many people have defended Russia and things like that. But to understand this thing, let's back up a little bit. Now, NATO is a military alliance. It's a defensive military alliance. The core value or the core motto for NATO is that an attack to one is an attack to all. Now, NATO was formed immediately after the Second World War, and it was in response to how the tragic events of the Second World War unfolded, where one nation just stands up and then begins to, want to annex every nation around it and annex every nation in the world. So nations felt, well, we can sit back and allow other nations take over our freedom. Let's form a military alliance that helps us defend ourselves, and come to the aid of each other. So NATO was formed. Now, the counterpart to NATO was what we call the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a pact, just like NATO, an agreement. Warsaw Pact was a pact between Soviet states and communist states in Eastern Europe and in European countries and Baltic states. It was a pact, a military alliance pact, that was also formed just to do the same thing that NATO was doing. Now, the thing is that the Warsaw Pact was dissolved in 1991, around February 1991, and then subsequently in December 1991, the Soviet states, USSR, was broken up. And when USSR was broken up, Soviet states, Warsaw Pact states that were pro-USSR, that belonged to the Warsaw Pact. Many of them joined NATO. Now the thing is, when they joined NATO, the Warsaw Pact had been dissolved. Now we must understand that the ideology of NATO is different from the ideology of the Warsaw Pact, and the Soviet states and the communist states. Their ideologies are different. And so nations that were formerly under the Soviet Republic and under the influence of communism and the USSR decided to join NATO. They felt like, well, we don't have a military alliance here anymore. This seems like what's the world power, what's coming up in the world. Let's join ourselves with this and get some military alliance. Now, what was the reason for USSR breaking up? Many of the states decided to no longer follow communism, to no longer follow the Soviet ideology of governance. So when the Soviet states broke up, Russia was seen as the inheritance, or the one that took over the remaining legacy of the Soviet Republic. Russia became the remaining legacy, and Russia's world power. Now, but the other nations that went ahead to join NATO were nations who felt, well, we're tired of communism, we're tired of the authoritarianism or totalitarianism. We're looking at democracy. Our people want to choose their leaders, they want to choose how they govern themselves and things like that. We need to be liberal. And NATO is a nation that encourages liberalism. And so these people joined NATO. And when they joined NATO, Russia says, well, it's a threat to our security. It's a threat to our security. It's a threat to our security. And so Russia says, well, NATO, do not expand. Don't get more countries. Don't have more countries join you. And countries are saying, well, we want to join NATO. Russia says, no, NATO, don't allow these people to join you. The people say, no, we have a right to self-determination. We have a right to freedom of association. We must join whoever we want to join. And so they say, we want to join NATO. NATO say, Russia says, no, NATO, don't allow them join. And that is the situation where Ukraine finds itself. Ukraine has been pro-Russia, but then in recent times, Ukraine began to become pro-West. Ukraine began to become pro-Western ideologies, pro-democracy, pro-liberalism. And so the former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was deposed from power because he was pro-Russian. Protests and then a revolution took place in the country in 2014, and he was deposed from power. And then later on, the next president that was voted in, Vladimir Zelensky, the present wartime leader in Ukraine, he was voted in, and he's pro-West. He aligns himself with Western ideologies and wants to become more of the liberal side. And then he's abandoning the ideals and the ideologies of Russia and the Soviet states. And then Russia is saying, no, you can't do this. It is a threat, a direct threat to our security as a nation. And this is the problem. And Putin says no. Putin says no. You must join. You must not join NATO. NATO, you cannot receive into your fold Ukraine. You cannot receive into your fold Ukraine. And so Putin goes ahead and invades Ukraine to prove to NATO that it is a power, it is a world power, and it can do what it has done to Ukraine, to any nation around itself that decides to join NATO. Now the question is, if Ukraine was a world power, or if Ukraine had military might, would Russia have invaded Ukraine? If Ukraine was seen as a country that had strong military power that could engage Russia in a battle and go for it face to face, tooth and nail, would Russia have invaded Ukraine? The answer is no. Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine. The second thing is, if Ukraine was already a NATO state, would Russia have invaded Ukraine? No. Now, Poland was a former Warsaw Pact country, and Poland is also a very close neighbor to Russia. And Poland even has more NATO presence because it is a NATO nation. It has more NATO presence than even Ukraine. So why did Russia not invade Poland? Why did it invade Ukraine? Ukraine is weaker. Poland is stronger. a bullet flies into Poland from Russia, it will be deemed by NATO as an attack to one, and NATO will respond to Russia. Russia cannot go head on with NATO in a war. So Russia looks for the weak one to make an example of it, and that weak one is Ukraine. That's unfortunate. Now, what has this thing taught me? This thing has brought two lessons to my mind. The first is you cannot go against the whole world. That's the sad truth that Vladimir Putin has to learn. You cannot go against the whole world. The world is changing. Times are changing. This is no longer 1945. This is not 1941. This is not 1913. You can't just wake up and decide to redraw the map of your nation. People are beginning to get the awareness that they have the freedom to self-determination. And if they have the freedom for self-determination, they determine what alliances they join, and so the whole world is now against Russia. Even if nobody is fighting against Russia except Ukraine, the whole world is fighting Russia. Companies are leaving Russia. Agencies of the United Nations are leaving Russia. Countries are shutting down their embassies and all that, their diplomatic presence in Russia. They're leaving. The Russian economy is in turmoil. The ruble is falling drastically every day. Russia is in problem. Russia is looking for where to get arms from. It's trying to borrow arms get arms from China. China says, well, we can't give you now. We're peacemakers. We don't want war, so we're making peace. But then the whole of NATO is pumping arms into Ukraine, supporting soldiers to fight against Russia, and that's why the fight is taking over 1 month. It's taking almost 1 month now. And Russia has not been able to realize its strategy in Ukraine. It's because it's fighting a fight against the whole world. Everyone who is pro-Russia is being sanctioned left, right, and center. Even the owner of my club, the club I support, Chelsea, Roman Abramovich, has been sanctioned just like that. And so you can't win a fight against the whole world. The whole world is against Russia, whether we like it or not. You call it a Western media propaganda, whatever you will. The whole world is against them. Why? The whole world is evolving towards liberty. Liberty. And NATO is more of a liberal organization than my guys in Russia. So what do we have here? The second point I think I learned from it is that you cannot be neutral if you're not a world power. And this is a point I think the Ukrainian people can tell better. Now, even Zelensky is saying he's ready to negotiate and then negotiate neutrality, but he's going to subject it to referendum. And tell me, after being displaced, 4 million people being displaced from their homes, from their families, losing their lives, thousands have lost their lives. You think those people will look Putin in the eye and say we're going to be neutral? No, hell no, they're going to join NATO. They're going to vote to join NATO. And so I think in international politics, you cannot be neutral. You can only be neutral if you're a world power, if you have good military might, if you're a force to reckon with militarily. But if you're not, you should not be neutral. Look for the bloc that suits your ideologies the most and align yourself with them. That's what I think. If not, what happens to Ukraine will happen to you. The day you decide to just dance around and play with one bloc, another bloc says you're a threat to them, and then they invade you. And nobody will do anything. They only support you to defend yourself. Your whole country is in turmoil. They're blowing up all the buildings. 80% of the buildings in the city of Mariupol have been destroyed, even 90%. And now they're facing Kiev. Displaced 4 million people and still counting. And that's the sad truth. I have to end it here, but my heart still goes out to everyone in Ukraine and every person who's gone through this hardship. International people who've left, who've had to leave what they were supposed to be doing in Ukraine, living peaceful lives because somebody refuses to see the next. Russia should ask itself, why are the former Soviet people abandoning us? That's a big question Putin should ask himself. Why is everyone who was pro-Soviet before becoming pro-West? Ask yourself. Now you must understand, even China is becoming more liberal. Even China is becoming more liberal to win more support and more alliances from other nations. How much more you? This is Talk is Cheap. I'll see you next time. Let there be peace and no war, child. Take care. Thank you.